liner impacts. John Skilling, the structural engineer in charge, said that in the event of an airliner impact, quote, the building structure would still be there. And we agree. So the question is, why did a total collapse occur? A professional animator has helped me create a few little clips to demonstrate for this presentation. So each tower had 236 super strength steel box columns making up the perimeter wall, and this was built around a core of 47 steel columns. The floor decking ran between in a staggered arrangement. To reduce the effects of fire, all of this steel structure was coated with a spray-applied fireproofing material. Before the buildings were occupied. And in the aircraft impact zones, this fireproofing was upgraded in just the few years before 9/11. Another point of agreement among all parties is that the theory that was claimed to be the most probable root cause for many years, called the pancake theory, in which the floors pancake down upon each other, is no longer supported by NIST. It's really no longer supported by anyone. And since 2004, when my former company did test models of the floor assemblies, the pancake theory has no longer been viable. The fire resistance of tall buildings like those at the World Trade Center is ensured through testing of samples prior to construction. My former employer, Underwriters Laboratories, tested and certified the fireproofing used in the World Trade Center towers, as seen in this quote from the company that manufactured the fireproofing. UL also tested the steel components used in the towers. This was well known due to a letter sent to the New York Times in 2002 from UL's fire protection manager, Tom Chapin, with whom I was in contact. Tom wrote, "The World Trade Center stood for almost an hour after withstanding conditions well beyond those experienced in any typical fire. In that time, thousands of people escaped with their lives." The important point, ASTM E119 and UL's testing procedures helped make that possible. UL tested the steel components used in the World Trade Center towers to meet the 1968 New York City Fire Code. That meant that the column assemblies had to withstand 3 hours of intense fire, and the floor assemblies had to withstand 2 hours of intense fire in a test furnace. And of course, the biggest problem with this is that one of the towers failed in 56 minutes. Here's the fellow that told me about this testing, Loren Novak, who was the CEO when I worked there. He later wrote to me and a few others saying, "We tested the steel with all the required fireproofing on it, and it did beautifully. As we do not do follow-up service on this kind of product, we can give only an opinion on the test sample, which was indeed properly coated, and we tested the code requirements, and the steel clearly met those requirements and exceeded them." And as I said, UL later participated in the NIST World Trade Center investigation, which was a clear conflict of interest. The NIST World Trade Center report is over 10,000 pages. It was originally published only for the towers in 2005, and like previous reports on the subject, it was focused only on the fire-induced collapse hypothesis. NIST made no real effort to examine the explosive demolition hypothesis. Here's the structure of the NIST report for the towers. This does not include the 2 sub-reports issued 3 years later for World Trade Center Building 7, and I will discuss those in the second half of my testimony. NIST's stated goals were to explain why and how World Trade Center Buildings 1 and 2 collapsed after the initial impact of the aircraft and why and how World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed. The scientific tests that NIST performed to reach its conclusions included tests to determine gas temperatures, tests to determine steel temperatures, tests to determine the possibility of floor failure, tests to determine the possibility of fireproofing loss. Unfortunately for NIST, none of the tests it performed supported its conclusions, as we will see. NIST therefore based its entire explanation on computer models. A summary of what NIST found was as follows. The aircraft severed columns, loads were redistributed, fireproofing was widely dislodged, high temperatures weakened columns and floors, floors began to sag, sagging floors pulled exterior columns inward, causing them to buckle. Instability spread around the entire building, and then they simply said global collapse ensued. We'll examine each of these steps. The first step in this sequence was that columns were severed. Again, it's agreed that the core columns were massive and over-designed, and the perimeter columns were made of super strong steel. But NIST now admits that 14 to 15% of the columns were severed in the World Trade Center towers. This is compared to original design claims published in the Engineering News Record when the buildings were first announced. They said that one could cut away all the first-story columns on one side of the building and part way from the corners of the perpendicular sides, and the building could still withstand design live loads and a 100-mile-per-hour wind from any direction. What that means, in essence, is that the towers could lose 25% of their columns, and they'd only lost 14 to 15%. The second step in this sequence was that the gravitational load was redistributed among the remaining columns. NIST said that loads on some columns were decreased, and on other columns they were increased up to 25%. Again, original design claims said that live loads on these perimeter columns can be increased more than 2,000% before failure occurs. The third very critical step in this sequence was that fireproofing was, quote, widely dislodged. NIST said the towers would not have collapsed under the combined effects of aircraft impact and the subsequent multi-floor fires if the insulation had not been widely dislodged or had been only minimally dislodged by airliner impact. As said before, the steel structure was covered with a spray-applied fireproofing material. There were requirements for the fireproofing to have a certain bond strength, and those requirements were met. In the center and right photo below, you can see how the fireproofing was applied to the columns and underneath the floor assemblies. The test that NIST performed to establish the critical fireproofing loss involved a total of 15 rounds from a shotgun at steel plates and bars. Here you can see photos from the NIST report of the results of these tests. But NIST did not explain how a Boeing 757 airliner could be converted into many thousands of shotgun blasts, which would need to be pointed in all directions to shear off the fireproofing. So again, let's take a look at what that might look like. The plane comes in and impacts the building, and then is converted into many thousands of shotgun blasts. Again, there's supposed to be fireproofing on this, and there's not. We assume covering the whole building. A real serious problem with this is NIST provided to us the energy requirements. And too much energy is required for this. Previous calculations by engineers at MIT had shown that all the kinetic energy available from the aircraft impact was consumed in breaking the columns, crushing the floors, destroying the aircraft. And NIST had tests that showed that 1 megajoule was required for every square meter of surface to shear off the fireproofing via this shotgun blast effect. That's more than 6,000 square meters of column, floor deck, and floor joist surface, according to the NIST report. That would be several times more than the entire kinetic energy available from the aircraft impact. So too much energy required. NIST 4-step requires large masses of steel columns and floors to be heated to temperatures that would make the steel soften or lose a great deal of its strength. But the NIST report says that the gas temperatures in the towers were only as high as 1,000 degrees Celsius. It does reference steel temperatures as high as 760 degrees Celsius, but the temperatures given by NIST, first of all, do not support their conclusions, and the physical tests, as we'll see in the next slide, that NIST performed resulted in even less agreement. With the physical tests for the steel temperatures, NIST's stated goal was to estimate the maximum temperature reached by the available steel. NIST accomplished this by selecting steel samples from an enormous amount of steel and by emphasizing regions of impact and fire damage in the selection process. They did 2 tests. The first was a paint deformation test, a fairly unusual test that they developed for this purpose, in which they tested painted steel samples over a range of temperatures and then compared the samples they had to that calibration curve. The result was that the samples from the World Trade Center had reached only a temperature of about 250 degrees Celsius. And again, that's much lower than the temperature needed to soften or melt steel, much lower. They did another test of steel microstructure, which showed that none of the steel samples had reached the temperature of 600 degrees Celsius. So again, these tests did not support NIST's hoped-for conclusions. A point of agreement between NIST and independent scientists is that the fires in any given area were of short duration. NIST claimed that the fires migrated around the core of the building over a period of time because that's where the fire load was. It was not in the core of the building, but in the office areas in the perimeter. For the North Tower, this migration time lasted 1 full hour, according to NIST, before the fires reached the south wall. So the plane hit the north side of the building. The fires migrated around to the south wall, as you can see, from top to bottom. This left us less than 45 minutes in the failure zone in the south wall. So I'm going to look again at a video here to show you what this theoretically looks like. The plane hit the building, fires rose up. NIST says the fires died down. Explosions do that, they consume the oxygen. And then over time, the fires rose up again and began migrating around the core of the building. It took a whole hour for that to happen, leaving 45 minutes of fire time at the south wall. Now, NIST claimed that the south wall then bowed inward from the fires there, but we might ask why the east and west walls, which had seen as much fire time, why they didn't show any bowing. It could be that something else was happening at the south wall. The 5th step in this sequence was that the floors began to sag. My former company, UL, participated in the NIST investigation by conducting tests on models of World Trade Center floor assemblies to examine the floor response to fire. The result was that only very slight sagging occurred in the tests and no collapse. After 45 minutes in a high temperature furnace, all 4 test models sagged only about 3 inches in the middle, and the major joist parts did not sag at all. NIST's computer model turned this into 42 inches of sagging with the joist bending down severely. To reiterate, UL and NIST built and tested exact replicas of World Trade Center floor assemblies. Here's a photo of one of those floor assemblies after the standard method, ASTM E119, was performed. During this test, it was held in a furnace at a temperature over 1,000 degrees Celsius for a period of 2 hours. You can see the slight effect. The midsections of the assembly sagged a few inches, but the frame was not damaged and the floor held its load without failure. The weight loaded was twice as great as what was known to have existed in the World Trade Center. These experiments were performed on 4 separate floor models, all of which had less fireproofing than was known to have existed in the World Trade Center on September 11th. If the sagging had been severe, as in the computer model, what would have to happen to make the sagging floors create these dramatic pull-in forces, as NIST requires? Sagging floors, for one thing, do not weigh any more than unsagged floors. But to defeat the original design claims, over 30 columns would have to be pulled in. And the floors were known to form this intense staggered grid with the columns, the way it was constructed. And the force required to pull a perimeter column inward within that grid and overcome that was far greater than what a sagging floor assembly could provide. Even within NIST computer models, the sagging and pulling effects that NIST explanation depends on were not seen. Not even for the most severe cases examined. Here are several quotes from the NIST report that make that fact clear. Sagging of floors in such a wide range over fire floors was not predicted by full floor model analysis. Locations and magnitudes of pull-in forces were not accurately simulated. Pull-in forces were applied in some locations where the full floor analyses did not predict the development of such behavior. NIST was simply not able to demonstrate this critical pull-in effect. Physical tests were not done, although that would have been decisive. The computer models did not indicate these forces either. And as a result, NIST made some fraudulent changes to the scenario. All the fireproofing was stripped off a large section of the computer modeled building, and exaggerated temperatures were applied for twice as long as NIST had said occurred in the failure zones. That is, they applied exaggerated temperatures for 90 minutes instead of 45 minutes. But even then, the pull-in forces were not created in the computer. So NIST did something completely paradoxical. It disconnected the floors before applying an imaginary pull-in force. So again, that's how they overcome the grid. And let's take a look at that. So NIST, in their computer model, this is an animation. The floors were heated up, they sagged, they still wouldn't pull in, so they disconnected the floors, and then they applied a pull-in force. You see, this is the opposite of science. This is not anywhere near science. No physical test done. The computer models do not give them the answer they want, so they do something completely fraudulent, which is exactly what they did. The final step of NIST sequence for the towers was that instability caused by the perimeter columns pulling inward spread around the entire perimeter of the building. This would be necessary to explain the perfectly uniform fall. Again, no tests of any kind were performed to confirm this instability spread. And for several reasons, it does not appear to be realistic. The buildings fell at near free fall acceleration, so the instability would have to fit within that time frame. If we give it only half a second of the time, then this instability spread is moving at nearly twice the speed of sound. That's not realistic. It's not shown in the photos. But again, building professionals they're aware, they've been aware for years that the steel structure does not collapse suddenly when attacked by fire. There are unmistakable warning signs like large deformations. So let's review some of the key tests that NIST did perform and see how the results were used. They asked what were the steel temperatures, found that they were 250 degrees Celsius, and then plugged 760 degrees Celsius into the computer. They asked if the fireproofing was widely dislodged, and their unrealistic test really showed that it could not have happened for that area of the building, and the fireproofing was entirely removed from the computer sections. They asked how much the floors could have sagged, and after 2 hours in the furnace, they sagged 3 inches, and in the computer, they sagged 42 inches after less than an hour. They asked if pull-in forces could be created. They're not produced in the computer. They did no physical tests, and they simply disconnected the floors and applied imaginary forces. And again, just to be clear, the task was why and how these buildings collapsed. And they stopped at the collapse initiation and did not explain the dynamics of the building collapse at all. So some of the evidence that they ignored when they ignored the actual collapse dynamics include the resistance of the structure below. If each floor caused only a half a second of hesitation, as you would think, an extra 40 seconds would be needed. They have these squibs coming out. They ignore that when they don't explain the collapse dynamics. They ignore molten metal, which you'll hear more about in the next few days. They ignore intergranular melting and sulfidation found on the steel by the earlier investigation done by the Federal Emergency Management Administration, of FEMA. And I just, in my opinion, this is my opinion, what objective scientists would have found, relatively few columns were lost on impact. Remaining columns had considerable extra capacity. Fireproofing could not have been widely dislodged. Steel could not have softened or weakened at the temperatures found. Even at higher temperatures and longer periods, tests showed minimal sagging of the floors. Forces were simply not produced to pull the columns inward, and instability spread would take much more time and would not result in uniform free fall. So finally, for the towers, the NIST report is false because NIST did not explain why and how the buildings collapsed, and the investigation was deceptive and unscientific. NIST reported findings that were in direct contradiction to the physical testing performed. This is what I was fired from my job for stating. NIST omitted or distorted many important facts. Now I would like to examine the NIST report for World Trade Center Building 7, the third building that collapsed on 9/11. Although we should look closely at the final NIST explanation, and we will, it's also informative to recognize that the previous government investigation reported by FEMA provided a best hypothesis that all agreed had only a low probability of occurrence. This building was 47 stories tall, was not hit by a plane, and yet at 5:20 in the afternoon on 9/11 it fell vertically and symmetrically in 6.5 seconds. After 7 years of waiting, NIST finally put out its official report on Building 7 in 2008. No one could have predicted the sequence of events that NIST says led to this building falling. It says that normal office fires caused fully fireproof steel beams to fail in one area of the building, and that's what led to this entire structure falling as it did into a neat rubble pile. To reiterate, the official story of the collapse of Building 7 is that a typical office fire caused this 47-story building to fall in a matter of seconds. If we were to accept this NIST World Trade Center Building 7 report, we would have to conclude that no tall buildings are safe from the possibility of total unexpected collapse due to office fires. All parties have agreed that the start of the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7 was very problematic. FEMA said the performance of Building 7 is of significant interest because it appears the collapse was due primarily to fire rather than any significant damage from the collapsing towers. And NIST said this was the first known instance of the total collapse of a tall building, primarily due to fires. They appeared to be ignoring the towers. The low probability hypothesis that FEMA described was that diesel fuel fires, driven by diesel fuel tanks located within the building, created intense fires that caused the collapse. And for years, NIST promoted that diesel fuel fires hypothesis as well, but NIST abandoned that hypothesis in its final report. NIST said diesel fuel fires did not play a role in the collapse of Building 7. NIST also suggested for years that the damage caused by falling debris from the North Tower was a root cause of the collapse of Building 7. Ultimately, NIST gave up on that hypothesis as well, saying other than initiating the fires in Building 7, the damage from the debris from North Tower 1 had little effect on initiating the collapse of Building 7. And contrary to some media reports, the building design was not an issue either. One serious problem was the destruction of evidence. The U.S. House Committee on Science reported that in the month that lapsed between the terrorist attacks and the deployment of the FEMA team, a significant amount of the steel debris was removed from the rubble pile, cut into smaller sections, and either melted at a recycling plant or shipped out of the U.S. Some of the critical pieces of steel were gone before the first FEMA team member ever reached the site. This is in violation to our national standard in the United States, at least, for fire investigations, which says that it is essential to prevent the destruction or removal of evidence. Another serious problem is that NIST was stumped for years. Now, they told us in 2006 that their lead investigator, Chaim Sunder, told New York Magazine that he didn't know. He's had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. There's a problem here because the new Building 7, which is taller, built in the same site, was completed in 2006. You would think they would want to know what happened to the first one. And 2 years later, they said they did know. They said it's no longer a mystery. The same man, Chaim Sunder, the lead investigator, it's all about science, and the obvious stares you in the face. So we'll take a look at this final theory now and discover for ourselves whether or not it's obvious. But we should remember that it's entirely computer-based. NIST did no physical testing at all to support its Building 7 report. I've given the panel copies of my presentation. You can find the NIST reports at this link, at this URL. You can check all of my references. But again, no physical testing was done for Building 7. It's entirely computer-based. Here are the basics of the NIST explanation for what happened to Building 7. The fact is they're saying that fire-induced thermal expansion of the floor system surrounding column 79 led to the collapse of floor 13, which triggered a cascade of floor failures. In this case, the floor beams on the east side of the building expanded enough so that they pushed a girder spanning between two columns, and this caused the girder to walk off its seat. You'll see more in detail. But basically this, here in the lower left, you see a diagram of a beam from this report pushing a girder off its seat. That caused the whole building essentially to collapse.
Excuse me, can you explain where column 79 is located in the building?
Yeah, I think I have a diagram for that. I'll be able to show you here. Here's a photo of the area showing the critical column 79, that NIST says was affected by the displaced girder. NIST says fires on the northeast corner of floor 12 heated the ceiling that included the floor beams for floor 13, causing thermal expansion of the beams. That is, the beams, the floor beams, here, were heated and they expanded and they pushed this girder off its seat. NIST said that column 79 then buckled due to loss of support from the girder, and the whole building collapsed in a matter of seconds. Here's a diagram showing this view of how the floor beams on the northeast side of the building, shown here as purple lines, pushed against the critical girder. The girder connected column 79 to the external wall at column 44. The girder to column connection is blown up in the inset diagram, showing how NIST envisions that the girder was pushed off its seat. On the bottom here you can see pictures that NIST used in its media presentation, more simple pictures. When it unveiled its final report. The picture is reversed again, but you can get the idea. An important point here, when we're talking about floors and the beams below them, is something called shear studs. The NIST interim report from 2004 said that most of the beams and the girders were made composite, or one piece, the floor and the beam, one piece with these studs. In a deceptive turnabout, in their final report, they said that no shear studs were installed on any of the girders. Unfortunately for NIST, it's not just its own 2004 interim report that contradicted this vital aspect of the final theory. The presence of shear studs on all the girders was also described by John Salvarinis, the project manager for Building 7, from the company that supplied the steel components. This diagram from an academic paper that Salvarinis wrote in 1986 showed that there were 30 shear studs on that critical girder. And for the question about where column 79 is, it's right here. NIST claims that thermal expansion caused the breakage of over 100 bolts, high-strength bolts. The mechanism that NIST claims caused all this damage is called differential thermal expansion. This is when the expansion of the beam below is much greater than the expansion of the concrete floor slab above it when they're both heated in a fire. Thermal expansion is not a new phenomenon, as NIST suggests, but has been a consideration throughout the history of structural design. You can see that point made here by two building professionals from Australia who wrote a response to NIST on its Building 7 report. These building professionals reported that they had actually done physical tests to see what thermal expansion would do to floor assemblies. These were just the kinds of tests that NIST should have done. Because they had actually done the test, the Australians were able to state that the shear studs would not fail, because in a building fire the floor slab would be heated as well, and the entire composite assembly would expand together. The concrete coefficient of expansion is very similar to that of steel. They would expand together at the same rate. So NIST's final theory is at odds with actual experimental evidence from the testing of real floor assemblies. Another thing we need to understand is just how far that girder would have to be pushed for it to walk off its seat, as NIST suggests. NIST reported that the girder seat at column 79 was 11 inches wide, and therefore the girder had to be pushed at least 5.5 inches, or half that distance, to walk off its seat. You can see that claim here in an excerpt from NIST's report. To repeat, NIST's initial failure mechanism for Building 7 was that the critical girder was pushed 5.5 inches by the floor beams. The 5.5 inches was needed in order for the vertical web of the girder, and therefore the center of mass of the girder, to move off the seat, theoretically. Because thermal expansion is a function of temperature, we need to know what temperature NIST says the beams reach so that we can estimate how much they expanded. This was a tricky question for NIST, because at temperatures as high as 600 degrees Celsius, the steel will lose some strength and stiffness, and therefore not be able to extend into the girder. At the same time, if the temperature is not high enough, there wouldn't be enough expansion of the beams. What NIST settled on was just in the area of the northeast corner of floor 12, the beam temperatures reached 400 degrees Celsius. On the lower part of this slide, you can see an example of just how tenuous NIST computer models were with respect to reality. NIST computer models had all the steel heating to extreme temperatures and all the bolts and other connections breaking within a matter of about 2 seconds. This is an example of how NIST computer modeling was not realistic. Once the temperature distribution for its theory was settled, NIST found a way to suggest that the differential thermal expansion could be possible, at least in the computer. They simply didn't heat the floor slab above. And this is what most scientists might call fraud. If you don't heat the floor slab, of course the beam's going to extend in differential expansion. But NIST theories has more problems than that. Given NIST temperature scenario, the amount of expansion by the beams would not satisfy the amount of expansion that NIST said was required, or 5.5 inches. NIST provided an example of the equation that the scientists used to calculate thermal expansion. When we put the correct values in the equation, we see that the maximum expansion would be only 3.3 inches. And as we already know from NIST, 3.3 inches would not be enough to cause the girder to walk off its seat. We know that the girder would have had to be pushed at least 5.5 inches for NIST's very improbable scenario to even begin. Another thing NIST said was that there were 7-hour fires in Building 7, which gave the impression that the fires were very long and very hot. But early photographs did not show full fires on floors 11 through 13, where NIST says the first failures occurred until after 2 p.m. And the building fell less than 3.5 hours later. So there could not have been 7-hour fires in those areas. Underwriters Laboratories provided the fire resistance information for Building 7 as well. There were requirements for fire resistance of the columns and floor steel in Building 7, just as there is for any skyscraper. The requirements were that these steel components had to withstand 2 to 3 hours of intense fire in standard tests. One big contradiction that NIST avoided is that its investigators knew that the fire load in the building would only support about 20 minutes of fire in a given area. When the NIST report talks about several hours of fire, it's deceptively talking about the time that a fire lasts anywhere on a floor, not in one specific location. Underneath a floor beam, for example, the fire time is only about 20 minutes, as this exchange from a NIST advisory committee indicates. The NIST advisor, Charles Thornton, asked, fire moved every 20 minutes, essentially it started and stopped every 20 minutes, so if you do not have fuel in Building 7, how could fires burn for as long as they had and taken out this major structure that had good fireproofing? Good question. And the lead investigator, Shine Slender, essentially admitted, yes, the fire moved from location to location every 20 minutes, and while the combustibles were being consumed, the fire front would continue moving to adjacent combustibles. So 20 minutes of fire in any given location. Another problem that NIST did not explain is that the fires on floor 12 were completely burned out at least 30 minutes before the building fell, and it's well known that steel cools quickly after a source of heat is removed. We should be able to verify how long the fires lasted in a given location, because there are photographs available from various times during the day, but it turns out that NIST did not use the photographs to verify its computer simulations. You might think I'm not being honest here. It's true. As you can see from this comparison of a photo in NIST report, taken at about 4 p.m., and the NIST simulation of fires on floor 12 at the same time, there is no correlation between NIST simulation and what really happened. At approximately 4 o'clock, NIST computer simulation shows raging fires across the north side windows of floor 12. The photo from the same time shows no fires in that area at all. NIST admits that its models did not use the observed fire activity from the photos and videos as a model input. Again, this is not science, and this is another example of why the NIST report is false. There are significant problems with NIST's description of the collapse dynamics as well. One problem is that the computer model output does not match what we see in videos. As you can see here, NIST computer model suggests the building crumpled from the sides before falling. Another problem is that NIST has admitted that Building 7 fell at free fall acceleration for a period of time, and that simply cannot occur without the structure below being removed by some unexplained forces. This problem will be covered by physicist David Chandler on day 3 of these proceedings. But to sum up, why the NIST World Trade Center 7 report is unscientific and false is that no physical tests were done to confirm the NIST explanation. The fire hypothesis is contradicted by known fire resistance plans. The fire in the building lasted only 20 minutes in a given area, while the steel components were rated for hours of fire resistance. NIST's final theory was based entirely on computer simulations that are not based on evidence. NIST fire modeling contradicts the photographic evidence. The fires in the critical areas were out long before collapse. NIST did not heat the floor slabs in its model of differential thermal expansion. NIST ignored known facts about shear studs on the critical girder. The maximum thermal expansion possible could not have caused the girder to walk off its seat. And this computer result does not accurately model the collapse. Regardless of the fact that the NIST World Trade Center 7 report is false in many ways, we'd like to see how NIST reached its conclusions. But we're not allowed to see those things. Structural engineer Ron Brookman, a colleague of mine, made a FOIA request to NIST in 2009 asking for the calculations and analysis behind the claim of girder walk-off failures. NIST responded that the release of that information might jeopardize public safety. That's the response. Another question that I have is, has NIST work on the subject been taken seriously with respect to building design and construction? As I said, the new taller Building 7 was completed in 2006. At the time that NIST lead investigator was saying he didn't know, he had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. But also NIST recommendations that have been adopted by the International Building Code Council do not relate to the causes of the destruction that NIST cited for the World Trade Center towers in Building 7. So finally, I would just say again that NIST produced World Trade Center reports that are false. They did not explain why and how the buildings collapsed, and the investigations were deceptive and unscientific. NIST reported findings that were in direct contradiction to the physical testing performed. NIST omitted or distorted many important facts. They will not share the results with the public, and therefore, an important point here, these results cannot be independently verified as required in science. And NIST explanations have not been taken seriously by the building construction community. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, Ryan. Before we move into questions from the panelists, if I could, I want to make a quick comment. We very much appreciate the cordial interaction and discussions between witnesses and audience. Yet we need to remind ourselves, and you as well, that it's most respectful to witnesses to wait to speak and to ask questions, as it were. You should have received, I believe, some sort of card or have available a card Speaking from my own experience, my questions only get better as I wait to write them. We are very eager to have those collected and addressed at the end of this day and every day. Thank you very much for your support. Panelists, we may proceed as we have. Question. Okay, I think Professor Lee was up by a hair.
Okay, thanks. Thanks once again, Kevin Ryan, for an excellent, detailed presentation. There's many issues I'd like to go over, and I hope to get a second and third kick at the can before our questioning is over. You mentioned at the very end that the engineering, the construction community doesn't take NIST's conclusion seriously. That is a really interesting proposition, because it suggests that there's a garage door that's wide open for some serious skepticism and serious inquiry. So could you say a bit more on how does a serious structural engineer go about their daily business, knowing that the trusted agency of the federal government is full of it?
Well, that's probably a better question for a structural engineer. I'm a chemistry laboratory manager, not a structural engineer.
Okay.
But yeah, I have looked at the recommendations that NIST has made, and those few that have been adopted by the International Building Council. And for example, some of them talk about strengthening the stairwells, reinforcing the concrete, and those are not things related to how the buildings collapse. So I believe that structural engineers are continuing the way they always have. In terms of fire resistance, they consult underwriters' laboratories, and they get information on how long steel components will last in a fire, and that hasn't changed. And it's a good question for structural engineers. I think it should be brought up to them. I don't know if there are any in the room today. I know there are several other types of engineers today. But I'll have to defer that question.
But if I could just comment further, it suggests that the catastrophic collapse of these three buildings has not affected the construction going forward, construction methods going forward, which is a kind of startling revelation.
Yeah, you would think that there would be a remediation program in place around the world right now, very seriously. If the World Trade Center Building 7 report is accurate, because it was, as the advisor said, office fire, attacking fully fireproof steel components for a short period of time, really. And there are buildings around the world regularly having office fires. And we weren't worried about coming into this building today. Hopefully we won't be worried about going into other buildings. But there should be, if this is true, some sort of remediation program to retrofit buildings, existing buildings, as well as design and construct new buildings.
Thank you, especially Professor Johnson.
I've had a little experience working in my early career in structural engineering, and one thing about structural engineers is that they are, in my experience, scrupulously honest. Either it stands up or it doesn't. And you have to respect the mathematics and the calculations that you make to make a building sound and withstand all the forces that will be brought to it. I'm almost embarrassed for the NIST engineers, I have to say. They were given an assignment which was in which apparently they were asked to come up with a preordained solution to a preordained story, and that's not the way we should proceed in analyzing an event of this kind, obviously. You've done a wonderful job of demolishing many of these assumptions and assertions made by NIST. Where do we take these assertions or these doubts that you've raised in our mind? Where should we take these now? Is the National Academy of Engineering a place where we can ask for verification? what objective engineering venue would be willing and able to do an objective analysis of the facts and opinions that you brought here?
Well, I believe there are many that we could approach, and several that we have approached. I'll just give you a little feedback. We have a team of us, including myself, Attorney Gorley, 911 family members, Professor Jones, Dr. Richard Gage, gotten together and submitted a request for correction to NIST. This is a formal process based on the Data Quality Act in the United States, meaning that a public agency that produces a report like this must produce data that's useful and data that's reliable. And if they don't, they can be approached, as we did, with a request for correction. So we put together a very detailed request for correction, explaining all of the problems, many of which we've talked about today, and others as well, and saying these things are clear, you need to correct your report. And so the response was basically short and sweet: we don't agree with you, point by point, no, we're sticking with our original story. So then we put together an appeal and submitted that via the Data Quality Act. The next step requires quite a bit more funding. That would be actually filing a lawsuit against NIST. So none of us are wealthy, but if we find the source of funding to hire the attorneys to do the work, we could do that. But we are regularly approaching agencies and societies. For example, as a member of the board of directors of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, I wrote a letter to the Royal Society in England in June because our president was there giving presentations in England. And so I very politely wrote to the president of the Royal Society. His name is Sir Paul Nurse. And I said, Sir Paul, there are several historical figures in your society that would be offended by this NIST report. One of them being Sir Isaac Newton. Because several of his laws have been violated. And explained this in a letter. Sir Paul did not respond to the letter, unfortunately, did not go to the presentation. But that's the kind of thing that we try to do, always reach out to people. And I think the legal action through the Data Quality Act is still a viable option, but we need funding. And then approaching Union of Concerned Scientists, for example, just regularly and objectively approaching them, I think could help.
Thank you. Other questions? Professor Jenkins.
Yes, I think this may not be the right time to ask this question, but from what you know of the way these buildings collapsed, if they were brought down by demolition, by explosions, would both the perimeter columns and the central columns have to be cut at roughly the same time? Would a destruction of the central core be adequate to give the results that we see in these videos?
Again, that's a question best answered by a demolition expert or perhaps a physicist. But as I understand it, in classic demolition, which this appears to be more of a classic demolition, from what I understand, the core of the building is attacked first so that the building will implode, will fall inward on itself. And you can see that to some extent with this. If you see at the top, there's a penthouse that indicates that the core of the building did fail first. And then the rest of the building came down. But it's a time sequence of explosions, as I understand. Very, very difficult thing to do. It takes planning. And it's not simultaneous, but close, I understand. So that perhaps we'll have another speaker in this proceeding that can answer that question better.
Just one more question, please. In the case of the Twin Towers, you report these explosions which appear to be at the edge of the buildings, the result of which is hurling out debris at high speeds laterally. Presumably, am I right in thinking that that would have to point to explosions at the periphery of these buildings, not just at the center?
Yeah, that would be my guess as well. but that would be speculation.
Thank you very much.
Yes, one question. Do you think that should be possible an expertise in order to establish the cause of the collapse of the building 7? Expertise with many experts in chemical engineering and other aspects, because you have tried to individuate the cause, but it seems that you have not individuated. So we have to try to ask the expertise, and you can prepare the question in order to establish the cause of this. So in this way, we cannot establish what is the cause, and we cannot accuse somebody. This is the question.
Yeah, so the first step that the organizers asked me to speak on was this: the official reports, are they valid? Are they true? And so we've established, I believe, that the official reports are not true. They are not valid, they're not scientific. And then from there, we're left, as you said, without an answer. We need an answer. We need people with expertise to help us understand what actually did happen. And a lot of people use the term demolition fairly loosely. There's a lot of, I can assume, a lot of ways to demolish buildings, if that was the case. There are professionals around the world who have said that does very much look like what has happened. There was a Dutch demolition expert by the name of Danny Jowenko who made it very clear, one of Europe's top demolition companies, this was a demolition. At the time, he didn't know this was the World Trade Center. He just saw this. Yes, that's a demolition. Hugo Bachmann is a structural engineering professor at ETH, a Swiss institute, ETH. And he said, of course, that's a demolition. But he can't tell you either, I don't think, exactly how they did it. Certainly can't say who did it. That still remains to be done, that work. And hopefully you'll help us recommend how to move forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Lee.
Yes. I think I have a strategy that might be the point of entry for us getting this thing moving again. One of the sticking points when you explain the demolition of these buildings to people is they come back to you and say, well, this would require that these buildings were rigged with explosives, and how could that possibly be happening if there's fully occupied buildings with thousands, if not tens of thousands of workers going in and out of the building every day? Now it turns out that there was a power down in the days before the collapse of the buildings, and there was work being done on the core. But I'm surprised that there hasn't been a great deal more attention paid to what was exactly going on in those power downs. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, in the weeks before 9/11, there were these power downs. I don't have a lot of information about those. In addition to that, there was an elevator renovation project going on in the 9 months before 9/11, throughout 2001. We know the company's name was Ace Elevator, went bankrupt afterwards, shortly afterward. We also know that a very interesting coincidence occurred with the towers, in that the few floors that had just recently been upgraded for fireproofing was exactly where the planes impacted and the fires occurred. In the North Tower, it was exact. The 8 floors that had been fully upgraded for fireproofing, floors 93 through 100, where it was exactly where the plane impacted. So the point there is, to not be too imaginative, but just to make the point, is that when the floors were down for fireproofing upgrade, the steel structure was made available, obviously, to apply the fireproofing. The building the floors were taken out of use, at least in sections, and the steel structure was made available. This was in just the 2 years before 9/11. So there's a number of possibilities for when the access could have occurred, but it's somewhat speculative at this point. So, and I don't know too much about the power lines.
But it does suggest that this could be a fruitful area of research going forward, because there should be, in the record, there should be building permits and all kinds of news, and even people from from former workers who survived the 9/11 say, oh yes, I remember there was a team of workers working on 4 floors where, you know, we had to get out or what. So I think there should be some inquiries initiated on that score.
Yes, some of that work has already been in progress. FOIA requests have been submitted. Responses have been received in many cases from the Port Authority who control the buildings and so forth, that those records no longer exist. In other cases, we do get a few records here and there and may piece together, for example, 1 or 2 of the companies involved in the fireproofing upgrades. But there's a lot of work to do, as you suggested.
Professor Johnson.
I think it would be very helpful to us in trying to think about this to get some kind of a reasonable lower bound estimate of how many man-hours would be required to rid these buildings to be consistent with what we observed at the demolition. And we also have to, if we're going to find access consistent with whatever that estimate of man-hours is, we have to do it for the 3 buildings. Not enough to say there's a power outage on certain floors in one of the towers or in both of the towers. You have to ask the question, was access available as well in World Trade Center 7? But I think perhaps we need as much information as we can get from people who know about demolition, and perhaps who know about demolition with sophisticated superthermite, to instruct us about at least the lower bound, so we can think more realistically about it.
I agree.
Other questions? John?
That's fine.
I want to ask you for curiosity. In our penal procedure, we have an instrument of search the truth. This is the judicial experiment, which consists in the repetition of the fact in the same or similar situation with the same material, the same temperature. So I ask you, it is possible in the little way to repeat this experiment with creating the same situation in order to establish if it is possible with this temperature the collapse of the building. It is clear? No.
Yes.
It is different from expertise.
That's right.
We must create a situation similar, if it is possible, and so you can establish it with this temperature the same building can collapse.
That's a very good point, Judge, if I understand you correctly. You're suggesting that perhaps we find a way to do some of the physical testing that the U.S. government agency did not do. For example, we could build some floor assemblies with floor beams and concrete slabs and see what kind of differential expansion it would be. We could, we could build floor assemblies and sag them and see what kind of inward pull there would be. We could just, instead of just theoretically, we could very clearly prove that that's not possible. So that may be one of your recommendations, and I would agree with that.
Thank you. Yeah. Professor Johnson?
Mr. Ryan, you have used some very strong language here, fraud and similar terms. We expect engineers, as good professionals, to be ethical. And there seems to be some question here whether this behavior on the part of engineers in NIST is unethical. We have been asked to look at a variety of conclusions about what we are seeing. Would you, and perhaps this question should be directed to an attorney, would you say that there is some evidence of criminal behavior here that we should be looking at?
Yeah, and I'm going to have to speak for my own opinion. I'm looking at the attorney right now, and he's taking his head. No, but so I'll tell you my experience then. My experience 7 years ago was after having spent a year asking the top managers in my company how this could happen, given the fire resistance information we gave them and the result. How could this happen? And no one knowing the answer. I wrote directly to the National Institute of Standards and Technology and allowed those questions to become public, was fired from that. And then, even then, it took me quite a while to even begin considering the explanation of demolition, or speak about it publicly. It wasn't until Professor Stephen Jones from Utah began speaking about that publicly, and his nature is such that it, for some reason, it was okay for him to do that. And the rest of us kind of said, oh, well, if he can do it, we can, and we'll start looking and talking about that. And then the word fraud, which I did use at least twice, I think, I'll stand by that word, given what I presented today, and given the 7 years that has passed, and my attempts to speak to these scientists in the government without response, our attempts to speak with them and collaborate with them and gain understanding with them, and their responses or lack of response thereof, and then the reports they've generated, have led me to that word. I think that may be where I need to stop with that.
Yes, Professor.
Some years ago, the owner of the buildings, a man named Larry Silverstein, was quoted as saying, and I'm sure half the people in the room are familiar with this quote, was saying, well, when talking about Building 7, he said, well, there had been so much loss of life that we decided to pull the building. And of course, a great deal was made for a while of that quote, and what exactly was meant by it. And it seemed there was a certain amount of weaseling around, and what did he actually mean by that? And obviously, your evidence is of an entirely different nature in the physical, chemical evidence. But would you comment on what was Larry Silverstein saying?
Yes, I will, mainly because I think this is a very interesting linguistic sort of a challenge here in terms of discussing this with people who support the official story. And I'll say that in that you, Professor Lee, said, Mr. Silverstein said, we decided to pull it. Right. The truth is that Mr. Silverstein said they decided to pull it. He was talking about the fire commanders. Right. They decided to pull it. Okay, and when I made the same mistake that you did once, saying we decided to pull it, the response was just, attacking. Just the people supporting the official story. I can't believe you used that wrong pronoun we instead of they. That's funny to some extent, because the response now to Silverstein's statement, they decided to pull it, is that it refers to a group of firefighters. Right? So
so they claim.
That's the claim. They decided to pull it, meaning it being a large group of firefighters in the building. Of course, the problem with that is there were no firefighters in the building at that time.
And then we watched the building come down.
And then we watched the building come down.
Please hold your comment.
But again, the pronoun challenge is interesting to me. Maybe I'm off on a tangent. People can criticize those of us questioning the official story on the smallest things, but yet come up with these explanations, it refers to a large group of people that are at least as absurd and intentional in that sense. I don't know if that helps in any way. Other than that, I don't know. I believe that pull it does mean, I think it does have something to do with bringing the building down by way of an intentional means. But that's just my opinion. I don't know for sure.
Yes, Professor Jenkins.
Well, I find this Silverstein quote extremely disturbing and puzzling. What he said apparently was addressed to a fire commander of the New York Fire Department. This commander has just witnessed the death of several hundred of his firemen in the first 2 towers. Are we to believe that he is now complicit in the demolition of World Trade 7? And could he, if the fire department said they are going to pull it, when would they have prepared the building to be pulled? These are really deep puzzles to me. Talk about cognitive dissonance. I have a lot of it.
Yeah, all I could say about that is, with the reports that we've been given, it's a tangled web that's been woven. And we have a lot to work through to come to the truth. It's always best, I think, to leave a lot of the statements and ancillary evidence and things that can be interpreted one way or another alone, and focus on the things that can't be denied, like the laws of Sir Isaac Newton. And if we continually do that, and you're going to find over the next few days more irrefutable physical facts, more irrefutable things that aren't left to interpretation, that I think will help. They won't answer all the questions, Professor Jenkins, that you've just asked, but they'll help set us on the right track.
I want to refer back briefly to the conversation we had just before the break when the audience was participating. And I thought that they were sharpening the point that we seem to be able, perhaps as a fault of the way our mind works, to deny certain brutal facts if we haven't got an intelligible context in which to put those facts. And I'm afraid that that's one of the obstacles we face. We have to walk some kind of a fine line between generating an intelligible context, that is one that says this is feasible. A rational person can imagine how this could be done. That's one side of this line. The other side is spinning out detailed, fanciful, easily discredited narratives. And what I'm saying is we need to show that the essential elements of the positive account, which is implied by the failure of the official story, it's strongly implied, it's inextricably connected to it. That is that they didn't come down from the airplanes, they come down from demolition. Who could have done it? How could it have been done? Those essential elements have to be made plausible without getting ourselves into this discredited fantasy life about the exact nature in which the thing was pulled off.
If I can suggest something, this is out of my field, but Professor DeHaven Smith might have something to say about it. I wonder if these reports in themselves can be considered a state crime against democracy. A false explanation, apparently an intentionally false explanation for a major crime. I don't know, but I would think that would be worth considering whether or not that in itself is a state crime against democracy. Outside of who committed the crimes, the actual crimes of 9/11, because the official stories, the false stories, have resulted in the deaths of many more people, in my view, than the crimes of 9/11 did.
Gentlemen, on that note, we're about at 4:15, and we might stop with the cross-examination, as it were, of our witness, Kevin Ryan. and move into our final session, which is your full participation. I wonder if at this time then, give an opening to Lance Hayden Smith, if we might not bring himself and David Ray Griffin up here to the center. Michael Kiefer and I will evacuate the center table and will moderate from the podium questions that we field from the audience. Are the witnesses amenable, or are they just so exhausted at this point that they prefer to stay where they're seated? It's okay with us, too. Okay, Kevin, join us. I see Lance popping up. Come on up, gentlemen, as you are able.
Can we thank Kevin first for the...
Oh, absolutely. Gentlemen, you have one microphone there to share between you. You seem like a judicious bunch. I'm sure you'll manage it. We have, you know, everyone's done something like this before, so I don't know if at this time we have questions collected. We have one question collected by someone who fully obliged our request. We ought to privilege that, I think, first, but we can say it on air. Here it is. Who will do the investigation if the FBI and CIA are complicit in the attack? And then there is a second question. The criminals will not investigate themselves. How does that work? Perhaps Lance, we'll start with you.
I don't have a good answer to that question. I don't know what we do to initiate an objective and detailed and thorough investigation.
Mike, speak up. Okay. It should be on.
How about, is this better?
Yeah. I'll pull out.
I was talking with the judge from Italy, and he was suggesting that we take this to the International Criminal Court of the United Nations. That might be a possibility. It's hard for me to see us doing this in the United States. Having a real investigation. It's very hard to imagine.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, one other possibility would be the General Assembly of the United Nations, which the United States does not control. So I would hope that people would explore that possibility.
Okay, let's move to another question. This says for David Ray Griffin, how many witnesses to 9/11 have died under mysterious circumstances?
I don't know the answer to that question. We know of one for sure is Barry Jennings, who was in the course of speaking out about Building 7, and suddenly he died under very mysterious circumstances. There was nobody would talk about it. We heard that he was in a hospital. What hospital? We don't know. We don't know what he died of. He just died. He was not very old. Does anybody remember how old he was?
50.
50 something. he seemed, when he was speaking to the BBC shortly before that he was in pretty good health. Now maybe like me, he had a staph infection and just suddenly died and didn't have a good doctor like I did. Who knows? But it does seem to be a case of somebody who was suicided in a sense. I've written quite a bit about that. Anybody who doesn't know about that, I've written quite a bit about it in World Trade Center, the mysterious collapse of World Trade Center 7. I've heard of other people have told me about other people that it sounds like they were involved with 9/11 and were either killed or disappeared, but it's nothing that I have any information that's concrete enough that I can speak about it in public. Do either of you know of anyone else?
Microbiology.
Oh yeah, speak on that.
Well, there were a series of strange deaths after the anthrax leather attacks. Microbiologists were dying very frequently. In one case, a person's car was found in the middle of a bridge with the door open, and just a strange circumstance. He was gone, and he's just not, hard to understand. When we look at David Kelly's death, it becomes easier to understand. He takes a walk at night. By the way, I don't walk at night in the forest, and I don't sleeping pills and pocket knives. But he was found in circumstances that are strange, and has been investigated. It amazes me. We think in the United States we have all this independent court system and freedom of speech and so on, but the British have done much better at opening these issues of the Downing Street memos, and well, at least they've had the hearings and.
Okay.
I could add one more comment about this. That with regard to JFK, there's a number that's suggested around about 100 people. Lance might be able to say more concretely about that who seem to have been killed under mysterious circumstances. Why so few with regard to 9/11 and apparently so many with JFK? Well, because with JFK you had official investigations. You had people who were getting ready to testify. If that were to emerge with regard to 9/11, we may suddenly see a whole bunch of such strange deaths.
I'll move on here. It sounds like there'd be for Kevin. Are there any calculations made about the amount of fuel that exploded outside of the buildings?
Yes, actually. And both NIST and FEMA agree on the quantity. FEMA estimated that of the 10,000 gallons of jet fuel in either of the two planes, approximately the same in each case, that was there when the plane impacted the building, about 1/3 exploded in fireballs, about 1/3 poured through various openings in the floors, the elevators, and then about 1/3 was left to feed the fires in the impact zones. And NIST agreed with that basic premise ultimately. They like NIST tends to do, they state a lot of different things, they contradict themselves throughout the report, but ultimately they said there's no evidence that came forward in their investigation to contradict the FEMA estimates of that 1/3 exploding outside, 1/3 pouring down, and 1/3 remaining on the floors to feed the fire. But one thing I would state is that the evidence includes the fact that there were massive explosions, in the lobby areas and basement levels of the World Trade Center towers. And it has been offhandedly suggested by official investigators that 1/3 of jet fuel that poured down various routes in the building may have self-ignited or ignited in some way 90 stories below. So I've looked into that myself. I haven't published anything on it, but if you consider the fact that there were 30 elevator shafts, and they all claim the elevator shafts, right? 2 of them were express elevators that went all the way down to the concourse, but about 30 on any given level. If the jet fuel, which by the way in the North Tower was not in the center tank at all, but was in the wing tanks, if somehow the jet fuel from those wing tanks made it through the office areas, found its way to the core, didn't, wasn't lost in any other telephone poles or anything, and distributed itself, I would assume, evenly among the 30 elevator shafts, not having a preference, for example, for the express elevator shaft. There would only be about 116 gallons in each one, right? So 116 gallons total at the top, 90 floors to go. The elevator shafts were lined with gypsum plank. Gypsum plank has a specific gravity that would essentially require that the jet fuel adhere to the gypsum plank. And even very conservative estimates would say that really that 116 gallons would be gone through adherence to the gypsum plank before it reached any lower levels. That's my analysis of it. I don't know if that's part of the question or not. Sorry, I went on.
That's all right.
Check me on this, Kevin. My understanding is that even NIST itself said that all the fuel had burned up within 10 minutes. You couldn't imagine that this stuff came out flaming and then quit burning to wait another 57 minutes or so before it exploded.
That's right. It's the question, we're trying to interpret the question here. The question was, how much did the jet fuel that remained in the impact areas contribute to the fires that caused the failure? Dr. Griffin is exactly right. All parties agree that the jet fuel in the impact zones, in the failure zones, burned off in just a few minutes. About 5 minutes, it was gone. In fact, some estimates were that it was more like 79 seconds. This was from a previous NIST director, James Quintier, a paper he wrote, was that it burned off in only about 79 seconds for his estimate. So the jet fuel did not contribute to the fires that caused the failure.
We'll take another question. Just so you know, for procedure, I'm taking these as they come. I'm putting, see here, I've got 2 in my hand. I want to make sure we get to online viewers, so I've got 2 here ahead of it, but I'm getting to the online for the moment. Question from Internet for Kevin. Other than thermite, what could explain heat and fires? Let's see here. Fires. For an extended period of time. Other than thermite, what could explain heat and fires for an extended period of time?
Well, for an extended period of time, if there is fuel and oxygen, fire can continue as long as it might. But the truth is, we know how long the fires continue in the towers. We know how long they continued in Building 7. It's not so much how long they will burn. The question of thermite is about at what temperature they will burn, how hot they will burn. And we will get into that in day 3 and explain detailed evidence as to what temperatures would be needed to explain the evidence. It's not really about how long the fires burn. You could have a very long burning fire that stayed at the same temperature, not a very high temperature relatively, but burned for a long time. Or you could have a thermite incendiary fire that occurred very violently, abruptly, at a very high temperature. So there are different scenarios there. I hope I answered the question.
Related, another question from online. Do we know anything about the company that upgraded the WTC floors where planes impacted?
Actually, we've been given information that points to at least two companies. One of them is Turner Construction. And Turner Construction is led by a man, I forget his name. He used to be the mayor of Dallas, I think. Or no, he lives near George Bush in Dallas. Am I right? But it's also, I believe, was a subsidiary of a Hochtief company, H.G. Hochtief. Is that right? A German company? Something like that. So Turner Construction, which also was involved in cleaning up Ground Zero. There's another company that's a little more elusive that I haven't been able to track down that's been referred to as Phoenix Fireproofing. And I've found half a dozen Phoenix-related fireproofing companies around the country and have not really pinned down who they might be. And I found no other references to this.
How were fires in Building 7 started from falling debris?
Well, it's interesting. NIST actually proposes two mechanisms in its final report and doesn't really say exactly which one it was. Instead, they suggest that the debris from the falling North Tower might have in some unexplained way started fires in Building 7. They would have started fires on the south side of Building 7, which is on the opposite side where essentially the northeast corner of floor 12, the initial failure mechanism was. The second proposed fire starting mechanism they suggested was that because the windows were broken from damage from the falling North Tower, that somehow something burning floated in through one of the open windows and started fires. Now the problem with that, either scenario is that fires were said to have started over many floors, 12, 20 floors, I can't remember exactly how many. They didn't all last a very long period of time, but that's a lot of fire started. The reason I say that is that relative to other buildings, the United States Post Office, equidistant from the North Tower, right next to the Building 7, or the Verizon building, New York Telephone Company building on the opposite side. They had relatively little damage, if any at all, in the photos. No fires. So Building 7 in the middle has all these fires and all this damage. Right next to it on either side, no damage, no fires. Again, coincidences accumulate the more we look into it.
Just to comment on how speculative the NIST report is on this issue. This Kevin referred to the 7 hours. They claim the fire was going for 7 hours. Well, how do we know it was going for 7 hours? Well, because it was still going at 5:21, and we know the fire started by the North Tower collapse at 10:28, and so obviously the fires had to last for 7 hours. Now, there's no physical evidence that the fire was actually burning all those hours. So it was very furtive, the fire was. So nobody could see it, but it was burning all those hours. Now there's another possibility. Somebody went in and started the fires, but that was not considered.
David, this is probably for you. Have any of the so-called hijackers ever been interviewed by anyone recently? I think you covered substantially on this, but is it still pertinent? No. Yeah, I think we're. David, also for you, can you think of any points in your canon of work that over time you have found to be in error?
Yes.
Comment here that you make quite relevant. It appears that efforts to discredit a good testimony is tied to errors, no matter how trivial.
That's true. People who want to criticize and debunk can find quibbles in almost any publication, particularly if it's a few years old. If I went through, I could debunk my own work probably better than anybody else. And I have in my later books tried to specify in certain places where I did make errors on this and that. I don't know of anything that I would call major, earth-shaking, that would undermine the basic premise of the work.
For Kevin, in addition to the fireproofing of columns, was any rust proofing used? And a follow-up, could a rust proofing coating contain an oxidative agent like thermite?
Well, that's an interesting question, but it might be best for day 3, I think. The steel in the World Trade Center buildings, particularly the towers, was coated with a primer paint, which would be rust-inhibitive material, rust-inhibited paint. So yes. Other than that, I'm not sure where the question is leading.
Well, we may have a follow-up at some point.
Thermitic paint has been discussed. I think that's best left for day 3 when we have more of the information, all of us working from the same sort of information basis.
And the next question, the insurers have paid $3.7 billion to the leaseholder because the buildings were destroyed in a terrorist attack. Why wouldn't they sue both NIST and Silverman to return their payment if they have evidence of fraud?
We've heard this question before. Now, really, it appears that the insurance companies, I'm not stating that they are doing anything deliberately unethical, but they are in business to make money, and they do make more money on their policies, the increases in the rates of terrorist-related insurance based on the official stories of terrorism. And so it appears that their best interest would be to go ahead and pay the billions of dollars and recover that in premiums. That's my best answer. I don't know for sure.
It has been reported that the buildings were largely unoccupied prior to 9/11/01. If this is true, is this true, and would that have provided the opportunity to set explosives to set explosives in the building? You spoke about there were 2-year period, I recall, Kevin, right?
Yeah, no, the buildings were not largely unoccupied. They were occupied. The towers as well as Building 7. Professor Witt mentioned the 2 years that I stated before. That relates to the fireproofing upgrades, the full floor fireproofing upgrades, particularly and how they matched up with the areas of impact and fire in the towers. I've looked into myself who occupied the buildings and written a series of articles on access to the World Trade Center towers. A lot of people have also referenced the fact that Building 7 had a lot of very powerful and secretive agencies within it. CIA had the largest regional CIA office, the Secret Service, Department of Defense, and so on. And also, all but 10 floors of the building, according to Wikipedia, were occupied by a company called Solomon Smith Barney, which had been purchased in 1998 by Citigroup. And but what I'm most interested in that is around that time, 2 people joined their advisory board, the president being Donald Rumsfeld, and another advisory board member being Dick Cheney. And so for the 2 years prior to essentially 2001, those 2 men were on the advisory board of the company that occupied all but 10 floors of World Trade Center Building 7. And they resigned in January 2001 to join the Bush II administration.
Why not fight fire with wire, is the question. To qualify, construct computer models based on extant evidence and publish them with proper caveats.
Is this a reference to finite element analysis? Does anybody know fire with wire? Was that
fire with fire. fight fire with fire.
Is that the question?
Yes.
No.
In other words, put out a computer model.
That makes more sense.
It says wire. Construct computer models based on existing evidence, available evidence, and publish them with proper caveats.
I think that's a good plan. That's one avenue, and there are people who have plans to do that. I believe the architects and engineers have a team, and they have a finite element analysis team. I don't know how far along they are. I've met people who have volunteered, as I've presented around the country, volunteered to help with that. It's no small undertaking. If anybody's done finite element analysis, it's a very detailed mathematical treatment. It requires modeling the buildings in detail, and the less detail you use, the less accurate your results are. But I think it's a reasonable idea.
Another comment essentially from the floor would seem worth following up. A claim here by the person commenting. An accountant who had just demonstrated a computerized voting machine was shortly since killed after pulling in front of an 18-wheeler. This is alleged to be substantiated by police report. That's right. With regard to what it will take to change people's minds about 9/11, does anyone know of any works of fiction being written about 9/11? In this report.
Let me say something else.
Sure.
There was a movie, I was not aware of this, but after President Kennedy was assassinated, there was a movie called Executive Action.
Right.
And it came out in 1973, and it gave a very detailed conspiracy account of the assassination. And I think it held up very well. It got a brief review in the New York Times, otherwise it got very little attention. But I do think that is something that we should hope that creative minds will try to develop scenarios to help us understand this. We keep getting the question, how could this have happened? How could people do this? We need to explore that, I think, artistically.
There was a film, The Reflecting Pool. I have not seen it myself, but it occurs to me. Is the rental tenant list available, i.e. companies and or their subsidiaries? It doesn't specify which towers, as it were. A rental or tenant list available, I think a comprehensive rental tenant list available of companies and or their subsidiaries. I'm not sure I understand the question myself.
Yes, I've looked into this quite a bit. You can find the tenant list for all three buildings online fairly easily. There's different versions of it. Sometimes they disagree, but you can get agreement if you look hard enough. And so the tenants I've looked into, I've written a series of articles, as I said before, and with regard to answering a couple of basic questions as objectively as possible. That is, who had access to the buildings, who had access to the necessary technologies, and who might have benefited from the attack. So you can find those articles online, which will go through the tenants as I saw them in North Kingston.
Going back to the question about how to bridge the gap between the believers and the non-believers, one of the common non-believer complaints, as you know, is that truthers cherry-pick evidence to support their argument and reject any views to the contrary as denial. How do you respond to these claims? Spur anyone.
I think of science as an effort to discover new things. I mean, let's say we went to Mars and we found an object and we weren't sure, we thought it might be a plant, maybe it was an artifact of some prior civilization. We could speculate about it, but at some point we would want to look. If we thought it was a plant, we would want to pick it up and look for a taproot. If we found a taproot, we'd be going, hey, this looks like a plant. This is definitely... If we didn't find a taproot, we wouldn't necessarily stop saying it was a plant. We might think it was a moss or a lichen, some other kind of And that's how I think of science. When we went looking for the missing link between apes and human beings, when we initially don't find it, we don't give up the theory. So there's a good deal of speculation and discovery. It's the discovery, once you hit it, that changes people's minds. The other thing I would add is it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to be wrong in science. Copernicus, the Copernican theory of the solar system, he had a concentric circle model for the planets. Well, they don't move in concentric circles. They move in elliptical orbits. So if you said he had to be right to have that theory, well, no, he was wrong. The elliptical orbits, Copernicus didn't think it was necessary to explain the orbits. He didn't need a concept of gravity. He said God was perfect. God made circles. Circles are perfect. And so these planets move in circles. And that was why he actually developed the theory of the sun-centered solar system, because he thought the other model had the planets moving radically about. And he said God wouldn't do that. So science is a speculation, and part of it you can find discoveries starting out from the wrong assumption and so on. The main thing that drives it is discovery. And failing to discover is not a problem. You gotta be willing to live with that.
This is a very common charge leveled against the 9/11 Truth movement. It's so common that even somebody as generally careful and thoughtful as Bill Moyers makes that charge against the 9/11 Truth movement. Some of us use the language of total evidence. You've got to, if you're going to have a theory, you've got to have a theory that takes account of all the evidence that you have, and is not contradicted by any of the evidence. Well, take my very brief presentation this morning about the 9/11 Commission. It cherry-picked wildly by ignoring all evidence whatsoever that contradicts it. It's not that it refutes it, it simply ignores it. Whereas with the 9/11 community, we look at the evidence, we look at the claims made by the 9/11 Commission, by NIST, and go through point by point by point, refuting their claims. That is not cherry picking, that is what a colleague might call science. Whereas what the 9/11 Commission does and what NIST did is not science. It's simply ignoring all evidence that doesn't fit your preferred theory.
Do the NIST reports mention anything about, for Kevin, do the NIST reports mention anything about the possibility of explosives or incendiaries in WT7 follow-up? If so, what evidence do they cite to refute this possibility? I'll let you take that and I'll give you the next one.
Okay. Yes, for the towers, it's important to realize that in their final draft report, NIST made absolutely no mention of the demolition hypothesis, despite the fact that for 4 years, many people were asking those questions. In their final report, they made a small disclaimer, some small statement, I can't remember the exact wording. NIST found no evidence for explosive agents in the towers. For Building 7, they kind of anticipated the question would be asked a little bit more. And ultimately, they wrote a section in their report that basically says that if column 79 were the first failure point in the building, so essentially, if you believe everything we've said already, then try to imagine what kind of size of bomb would need to be placed next to column 79 to make the building blow up from that one column. That's essentially what they said. And they said, we know that that big bomb was not placed next to column 79 because it would have made a really big sound. It would have made a really big boom and nobody heard the big boom. So there were no explosives in Building 7. I mean, you may think I'm exaggerating that explanation, and maybe I am slightly, but that's basically what they said. If you accept everything we have said about the failure mechanism for Building 7, that column 79 fell down, it collapsed because of whatever unsupported scenario, and that caused everything else just to fall in 6.5 seconds. If you believe that, which I'm sure you do because we're NIST, then try placing a big bomb there, and the bomb couldn't have been there because we didn't hear it.
Follow up. Have there been other independent bodies or engineers who have responded to NIST's open call for feedback on its WTC7 report who affirmed NIST's conclusions? Like, for instance, Society on Tall Buildings at Lehigh University.
Yeah, NIST did have a number of supportive statements in the open public comment section, our time period. I responded as well, perhaps a little bit less supportive, but and I also mentioned in my presentation that a number of professionals responded saying we don't agree with your report at all. But there were some. There's a company called ARUP. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. ARUP. A number of their employees responded saying basically, "Hey, great job. You know, we support you." They didn't. I'm not aware of any actual investigative results that anyone else has produced to support the NIST World Trade Center 7 report. It's just basically, we appreciate your work. Those sorts of comments.
Also for Kevin, what was the reason given for your termination from Underwriters Laboratories?
Well, I have a termination letter. You can see a good deal of that at my blog. It's called digwithin.net. Digwithin.net. The About page, you can see this portion of that UL termination letter. It explains basically that I had written this letter to NIST. NIST was UL's client. I harmed UL's relationship with the client. Basically, I believe it says use poor judgment, and to that effect. So basically, harmed the relationship with their client NIST. And as I said, it really was a conflict of interest for UL to be participating in the investigation that concluded that these buildings fell from a lack of fire resistance when UL provided the fire resistance information for the building. So hopefully someday someone will look into that.
To Dr. Griffin, to affirm a suggestion by Professor Lance Haven Smith and offer a competing request for your next investigative book, please comment on the potential value of further scrutiny of the anthrax attacks. There's a lot following up on that. Where the official story has a legal defendant, though dead, and a lawyer who's still alive, and many experts and co-workers that dispute the FBI case against this 20-year veteran of service to military-industrial complex, who in his spare time, after hours in the lab, planned and executed over the previous year or years a biologic attack that would attempt to frame Islamic radicals and would coincidentally be timed to occur just after the September 11 attacks and target some in Congress and Senate who were resisting the Patriot Act and coincidentally, though not convincingly, provide a plausible state sponsor, namely Iraq. I think it's supposed to be clear. How you respond?
Actually, it's a quite good statement. Everything that was said there, at least most of it, I can't recall everything that was said, but most of what was said was true. And I affirm completely what Lance said this morning, is that we need to think of those two events together. And in one of my foolish periods, I thought I was actually going to get a book completed on the anthrax investigation. And then events overtook me, which meant another book on 9/11 took precedence, and then illness. So I had a book that was maybe, I don't know, 3/4 written or something like that, and at least I had done the material for that book, and of course that's most of the work. And I still think it's something that needs to be done, and that we need to think of it in relation to 9/11. Graham McQueen has actually done a brilliant paper on that, which he gave in Walkerton a couple years ago. And if you've not seen that, is that available? That's available online, right?
The talk is.
Yeah, the talk, yeah. What's it called? It's called Graham's Talk.
So have I, David. So have I.
Pardon?
So have I.
Yes, what's the name of your...
It's called The Scarlet Egg. I'll be giving the link tomorrow.
Oh, okay. See, Graham, you got to remember your title. Did you want to add anything to that? Yeah. So we agree.
Does anyone here believe Bin Laden was killed on May 2nd?
Do we believe that what?
That Bin Laden was killed on May 2nd as officially claimed by the U.S. government?
Show of hands?
Oh, I don't know if it's for the audience, perhaps it is. I mean,
Show of hands.
I think insofar as we're directing questions, the witnesses will start with that.
I think we're just going to witness.
I thought it was time to assure that there would be no Democratic primary rival. What I couldn't ask, I mean, I don't know whether they killed him or not. I'm very doubtful about it because we don't see any photos and they get rid of the body right away. But they said that they found him there like in August of the preceding year. And then they sat on this for 6, 7, 8 months. And you would be thinking, wouldn't they be worrying about him escaping and slipping through their fingers like a Tora Bora, this kind of thing. But no, they sat on it. And then they happened to do it just before a primary rival would arise if it was going to. So I thought it was in the bag somewhere and they pulled it out and they used it.
Okay.
In Canada, we had the national elections the next day. You all remember?
It also coincided with the publication of the book, Where's the Birth Certificate? It came on the same day.
By the way, I'm not commenting on this question because I don't think Bin Laden had anything to do with 9/11, and our topic here is 9/11.
Is there a statutory limitation after which an appeal to NIST's responses cannot be filed? Or James?
Yeah, this may be a better answer or question for our attorney. I don't recall if the Data Quality Act has a statute of limitations.
No, not on murder. Not on murder.
Not on murder.
It's not a murder, it's a question about...
So it's a question really, it's the legal action would be on the Data Quality Act, though it would not necessarily be a lawsuit, a trial for murder, although it may lead to that.
I'm going to interject just momentarily here because there was a question posed, I think, from the panelists. It seems very pertinent to Lance about he didn't have a chance to respond. I don't think. Were they accessory after the fact, or were they themselves perpetrators of crimes? Those agencies that have propagated
The cover-up would be a crime. There's a criminal statute that penalizes misprision of felony. If you're aware of a crime and you do not report it, that is a crime. So I think we need to examine, I think they've gotten more sophisticated at covering up. You go back and read the Warren Commission report, they actually talked about the possibility of a conspiracy. You read the 9/11 Commission, and they don't even mention the counter view. Same with this, you don't take it up. So they become much more adept at deflecting suspicion by just not saying it.
For Kevin, while WTC 7 destruction looks like sophisticated but conventional demolition, WTC 1 and WTC 2 cases are unusual in that they are starting from the top and working down. This represents, I imagine, a new demolition design of great subtlety. So therefore, surely there are only very few, underlined, very few companies, 1, 2 maybe, that are believable perpetrators. What response can be obtained from these few?
Well, that's a good question. I have not asked any of the major demolition companies for an opinion on this myself, but I think it's worthwhile to ask that question. I have seen video of top-down demolition before on the web, and I can say it was interesting when I 4 years ago debated with a man named Michael Shermer of Skeptic magazine on Air America Radio. And he, in the 2-minute break, had pulled up all the demolition videos on Google. Said he'd watched them all, thousands of them, in the 2-minute break apparently. And they were all bottom-up demolitions. But it's not true that there are top-down demolitions. They have existed. I've seen them on video before. It's a good question, I think, for demolition experts. I'm wondering how many of them would be willing on this particular topic to speak openly, given that demolition is done by contract, requiring public permits, therefore requiring government approvals. And so I don't know how open they would be in answering.
There have been reports. Sorry.
I'd like to address this to either Kevin or Niels Harrod. There's been speculation, and that's what the popular, the official story said, that they think that United 93 was coming in to hit a building, and maybe it was a government building, or maybe it was Building 7. It seems to me that the fact that the Twin Towers were topped down for the sake of making it appear that the building, the planes had hit them, and that was the source of their destruction. It seems like the fact that Building 7 was a bottom-up, even appeared to be a bottom-up one, would refute the theory that that there was any intention for a plane to hit Building 7. Does that make sense to you?
You said you thought they were delayed.
Yeah, my own speculation in my book was that that Building 7 was supposed to come down shortly after one of the Twin Towers came down, so it was still so smoky there that they would not have any photographs. The question is, why would they have waited till 5:21 in the afternoon when they get these crystal clear videos of Building 7, which virtually prove it was a, for anybody who can think of these things, so I think it was supposed to come down in the morning, and there's several bits of evidence that support that. So that would be. But I had just thought of this now, that the fact that it's bottom up would seem to refute the theory that the building anyone had intended for a third plane to come in to hit Building 7.
I'm sorry, Dr. Griffin, I don't really have a scenario offer for that. I do know it was interesting that a public official, his name was Richard Rotans, was behind the statement that a third plane was coming into the World Trade Center. This was early, as you were implying, this was early in the day when Rotans said that another plane was headed for the area. And it was, I believe, part of the reason why World Trade Center Building 7 was evacuated. Rotans was also behind another claim, I believe, an unusual claim, I believe, was the extensive damage to Building 7, something like that. But I wanted to, while I still can, if I may, just speak about two things that Lance had mentioned. First of all, the NIST group does begin accepting a large part of the official story, if not the entire official story. To read the report, the first few lines are American Airlines 11 piloted by 5 hijacked terrorists impacted the building. You know, how could they possibly have found that result from their scientific investigation? Did they find the remains of the 5 hijackers? No. Did they see them in the photos? No. They just obviously accept the entire story to begin with. The second thing was, you know, what we're doing, hopefully here this week, is presenting evidence that that is straightforward, factual evidence. And getting back to cherry picking, you know, scientists regularly accept factual information. For example, around the planet Saturn, there's a moon called Titan. All scientists agree that Titan's atmosphere contains the chemical methane, compound methane. I mean, they haven't been there. You don't know how it got there. But all scientists agree it is there, based on factual information, the wavelength of light being received at Earth. We know that Titan has methane in its atmosphere. Similarly, we know that the World Trade Center buildings exhibited a lot more than one characteristic of demolition, of the use of explosions. It's not cherry-picking evidence. It's not cherry-picking evidence to say the NIST reports are false and the 9/11 Commission reports are false. Those are factual statements. That's a lot more than just the wavelength of a light. And you would think by this time, scientists and professionals around the world would be joining us, admitting to these facts.
You know, we're coming to, it's a little after 5, I think we're running out of oxygen in the room. I think we're going to, as moderators, exert the authority to close out at this point. Okay.
Yes, I have a couple of announcements to make from the organizers. The first announcement will tug at your heartstrings, or for some of you more strongly at your purse strings. For those persons who came in this morning who have not yet paid, the organizers announced that we are now able to accommodate your payment at the registration table. And the second one is, I think, perhaps more urgent request. The steering committee would like to say that it's very pleased with today's attendance and proceedings, but to note that today we have been just under the capacity for this room according to, and this is heavily underlined in the text I have here, fire codes. I'm not sure if this is related in any way to discussions of as the conference proceeds, we fully expect to have full attendance. In fact, we expect on the Saturday and Sunday sessions to have more people wanting to attend than we can accommodate. Thus, we wish to remind you, and I really underline this, that for the next 3 days, in order to be admitted to the room, all attendees and guests must wear an identification badge. If you don't, you risk not being permitted into the hearings. We wouldn't want that to happen. We wish to have a very successful next 3 days, so do please help us by ensuring you don't misplace your hearing badge. I do this at nearly every academic conference I attend. Please don't do that. and have it with you. Now, this concludes then the first day of these international hearings on the events of September 11, 2001. I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists and expert witnesses for their splendid contributions to today's sessions. I think it has been invigorating and informative. I'd like to thank our audience, both our audience here and online audience from whom we've received input as well, for your attentiveness and your contributions to a vigorous question and answer period. It would be nice if we had more time and more oxygen for a more extended Q&A. I'm confident, though, that the words that have been spoken in this room today will resonate strongly in ongoing public discussion and debate this evening, in the coming days, and not just here at Ryerson University in Toronto, but in many other places as well. In tomorrow's sessions, we will hear testimony from Jay Kolar, Paul Zaremka, Barbara Honiger, Richard Gage, and Michelle Chossudowski. Our first session will begin promptly at 9:11, and we're going to do... That was a good one. It will begin promptly at 9 o'clock in the morning. And we would ask you to please take your seats shortly before, so that we can, as we managed miraculously to do today, stick to our schedule.
Yes, very nice.
I'm reminded of a foolish omission here. Cynthia McKinney will also be speaking. Thank you again, and until tomorrow. Yeah.